The Shadows of Elm Street, A Dark Past. Revealed Elm Street, a sleepy little corner nestled in the outskirts of an unnamed American town, once seemed like any other suburban cul-de-sac. It was the kind of place with picket fences and aging lampposts, the kind of place where the occasional whiff of fresh cookies from a neighbor's kitchen would mingle with the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Ordinary, unassuming. This was, above all else, a working street, a melting pot where the desperate and the downtrodden gathered under the radar of polite society. Outsiders might even call it quaint at first glance. By day it was almost impossibly quiet. No cars honked, no children played, and no dogs barked. The world seemed to drift lazily there as though time respected the routines of its weary residents. But by night, Elm Street became something else entirely, an eerie, almost spectral figure of its daytime self. The flickering streetlights and darkened alleys carried a sinister tone. This wasn't the kind of street immortalized in Norman Rockwell paintings. There were shadows here that spoke of pain, survival, and secrets no one cared to examine too closely. Primarily home to a transient population of immigrant workers and disenfranchised individuals, Elm Street saw its fair share of struggles. The rented houses were mostly occupied by families chasing a dream that always seemed maddeningly out of reach. Construction workers who left before dawn and came home when everyone else had already turned out their lights. But it wasn't just the immigrants who tried to make ends meet on this weathered, inconspicuous suburban avenue. For decades, Elm Street had also been a lifeline for women forced into the harrowing world of streetwalking to survive. These women came here in the dark, painting their faces and hiding their realities behind smiles meant to lure customers they didn't dare trust. Many of them were single mothers, desperate to support kids who didn't know what their mothers were doing when they went out at 11 p.m. and came home as the sun rose. Others were young girls promised the moon by traffickers who later ensnared them in chains where hope eventually atrophied. Few asked how or why these women ended up in that line of work. Fewer still cared to stop their cars for anything other than fleeting business transactions. Elm Street had become an open secret, a place the comfortable and middle class would gossip about but never admit to frequenting, unless it was to quiet their own vices. The tragedy of Elm Street was sealed long before it earned its reputation for bloodshed. Abuse, poverty, and social neglect had shaped it into a place where people disappeared into the cracks, not in the literal sense, but spiritually. Neighbors avoided eye contact not out of cruelty, but because they feared a certain acknowledgement of shared defeat. It was a street ignored by the police unless something exploded, ignored by the community unless the wrong kind of people started lingering too long near respectable storefronts 3 miles away. It was fitting then that no one paid much attention when things started happening on Elm Street over the years. Night after night, women would gather under the dim glow of the remaining streetlights, leaning against chain-link fences or pacing the cracked sidewalk. These were faces hurriedly marked with cheap lipstick and eyeliner that smudged in the biting wind. Some, like Maria Gonzalez, a single mother from Guatemala, came armed only with a fake smile and a tattered purse. Others, like Darlene Foster, a former waitress fallen on hard times, clutched worn jackets tighter over tired shoulders. Elm Street had become everyone's last stop when life gave them no other choices. As the 1990s progressed, the area transformed further. The buzz of redevelopment projects downtown had little effect on the battered homes and potholed streets of Elm Street. In its neglect, the street grew darker, or perhaps it only became easier to see what had always been lurking there. At its core, Elm Street was symptomatic of a much larger social illness in America, where those left behind by society gravitated together, seeking survival the only way they knew how. In hindsight, it's tragically poetic. What took root in the soil of desperation would one day attract evil. Because amidst its anonymity, this quiet, unremarkable street, Elm Street bore witness to the unthinkable. It would soon become infamous not for its stories of survival but for the horrors that stalked silently beneath its flickering streetlights. After all, for predators who thrived on the weak and forgotten, Elm Street was the perfect hunting ground. The first signs: disappearances and discovered bodies. It began like any other story of neglect and despair, in a place where lives were lived mostly out of sight. The year was 1995, and quiet whispers had started to spread among the women of Elm Street. One by one, people began to notice the unsettling absence of familiar faces. Maria, the Guatemalan mother who often stood near the corner with her weathered handbag, wasn't seen for over a week. Then it was Rachel, the soft-spoken young girl from Kansas, whose naive smile had made her a comforting presence despite the dangers of their shared profession. These weren't outright alarms at first. Life on the fringes doesn't allow for much panic. People come and go, sometimes for a new opportunity, sometimes to escape debts, and sometimes simply to disappear. But the pattern became harder to ignore. 2 weeks later, another woman, Tasha, a sharp-witted single mom from New Orleans, also vanished, leaving behind her toddler who waited endlessly at their small apartment just a block away from the streetlights of Elm. At first, the local women exchanged worried glances and dismissive theories. Maybe they found safer places to work, maybe they'd gone back to their families, maybe they'd had enough, and just vanished into thin air. But then came the first body. It was discovered 2 miles away under an overpass, near an industrial warehouse no longer in use. The smell hit the construction team first before they actually spotted it. A decayed and unrecognizable figure, smothered under old tarps, disposable fast food wrappers, and broken wooden pallets. Initial reports suggested it belonged to a woman in her mid-30s, though the remains were so badly decomposed that the forensics team later struggled to confirm her identity. What they could confirm, however, was the cause of death: strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. News spread quickly through the tight-knit yet fractured community of Elm Street. Fear gripped every corner of the street where lives already dragged under the weight of survival. For the women who had witnessed brutality in its most intimate forms, this wasn't shocking. It was haunting, but not surprising. Still, they couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening, something merciless that was now moving in the shadows so close to them. A second body was discovered only a few weeks later, this time on the outskirts of a shopping plaza at night. Her body was hidden in the dumpsters behind the hardware store, wrapped in a cheap motel blanket with cigarette burns seared into the fraying fabric. She hadn't just been strangled, she had been tortured. This one hit closer to home because some of them thought they recognized her wilted red vinyl boots, ones that had shuffled along the cracked sidewalks of Elm. By this point, the local police, long accused of looking the other way whenever the lives of marginalized people were involved, had no choice but to admit they were dealing with something far darker. The killings were calculated, their cruelty deliberate, and their frequency unnerving. In only 1 month, 2 women who sold their dignity to survive had been silenced forever, and the discovery of the second body was only the beginning. The fear became tangible now, almost breathable. On cold, wind-filled nights, the rustling of chain-link fences or the distant clicking of shoes on pavement set some of them on edge. The once slurred offers of companionship to passing cars were now delivered with quicker, more urgent words. Some of the women stopped working altogether, unwilling to risk their safety, despite the stomachs they had to feed or rent looming at the end of the month. The whisper network got louder with every broken rumor, every frantic knock on a neighbor's door. "Who's missing now?" became an unnerving refrain. Some tried to armor themselves with makeshift weapons, a stun gun bought off a sketchy street vendor, a rusty knife tucked into 2 small jackets. But it didn't matter. Whoever, or whatever, was targeting them wasn't fazed by paranoia or precautions. The third body was discovered less than 3 weeks later, deeper into the marshlands by a river known for its freezing cold waters. A fisherman stumbled upon her wrapped in plastic, half submerged. Her death wasn't just brutal, it was theatrical, almost staged. Her hands were tied with a coarse rope and duct tape covered her mouth. But what truly horrified the coroner and the police was the evidence of prolonged suffering. She had been alive long after her kidnapper had taken her, kept in what investigators could only describe as controlled agony before being disposed of. What kind of person does this, they wondered. Elm Street, already fragile and fragmented, began to collapse. Those who could escape did so. Many middle-class renters left while terrified whispers crept into the suburban cocktail parties of the neighboring districts. But for those who couldn't leave, primarily the workers, the immigrants, the women, they adjusted to living in constant terror. Some started to notice strange cars circling the area at odd hours. Others swore someone was watching from the shadows, their movements deliberate but always vanishing when anyone drew near. The police presence increased, of course, but it only amplified the discomfort. Patrol cars crawling through Elm Street smothered what little normalcy was left. This wasn't protection, it felt like they were waiting, like everyone was waiting, for the next body to be found. And found it was. The fourth body, discovered behind an abandoned movie theater just 7 days later, confirmed what most already knew. This wasn't random anymore. This wasn't the work of desperation or chance. It was a predator, a calculated, vengeful force sweeping through Elm Street's most vulnerable like they were nothing more than pawns in a savage game. What made it colder, more unbearable, was the growing indifference outside Elm's borders. The media began to cast a lurid spotlight on the victims, framing them in sensational headlines as streetwalkers with troubled pasts. Their humanity was stripped away in favor of clicks and speculation, and their names, if even spoken, were treated as cautionary tales instead of real people with stories, dreams, and loved ones who mourned them. The signal flare had been sent, but no cavalry was coming. Elm Street would not be remembered for the love its people poured into their simple lives amidst their struggles. Instead, it would be stained by the grotesque red handprint of a monster no one else had chosen to see until it was too late. Who was he? The Night Predator, a killer cloaked in mystery. The media was quick to label him the Night Predator, a moniker that captured both the terror and the enigma surrounding him. And yet, even as his crimes escalated, the man behind the mask remained a ghost. Elm Street shuddered under the weight of his looming presence, a monster operating undetected in the shadowy margins of society. The police had little to work with in the beginning, just the battered remains of his victims, left in gruesome displays that seemed sickeningly calculated. The brutality was unlike anything they'd seen, yet it spoke of intention, of a twisted sense of control. Whoever this killer was, he wasn't acting impulsively. He wasn't chaotic. This was not the frantic violence of someone unhinged. No, the Night Predator was methodical, deliberate. He was playing a game only he understood. His victims appeared to be chosen with care, although the criteria were unclear at first. They were women on the fringes of society, sex workers, immigrants, single mothers, those society often overlooks or deems expendable. It seemed that he preyed on their vulnerabilities, exploiting their isolation, and yet, the way he discarded their bodies with messages carved into their flesh or items deliberately left at the crime scene hinted at something deeper. This wasn't just about control. This was about hatred, almost as if he wanted to punish them for simply existing. Speculation ran rampant. Was he someone local, an ordinary man who quietly blended into the fabric of Elm Street life during the day, or was he an outsider, someone who drifted in and out quickly enough to leave no trace? The killings bore the hallmarks of someone who knew how to disappear, how to cover his tracks, but he wasn't entirely silent. Through the cruelty of his acts, he was speaking a language only he understood, a language of contempt, anger, and destruction. Police profilers, flown in from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, began to piece together a psychological portrait of the predator. They suggested he was likely a middle-aged white man, someone with an unremarkable outward appearance that allowed him to move unnoticed. Their theory was that his calm demeanor likely fooled everyone around him. It was possible he even held a job or role that required interactions with people, masking his monstrous impulses behind an air of responsibility. Someone you'd nod to in passing at the grocery store, someone who might fix a neighbor's car or casually chat about the weather over coffee at a diner. But what made him tick? What fueled the gruesome nature of his crimes? The profilers had theories. This level of sadism didn't just come out of nowhere. Perhaps he had suffered a profound trauma, emotional abuse, a troubled upbringing, rejection by women, or humiliation that had planted the seeds of his hatred. The killings, they theorized, were his way of reclaiming a warped sense of control over all the things he felt he had lost or been denied. Yet something set the Night Predator apart even from other serial killers. His crimes weren't unpredictable, but they weren't entirely regimented either. He didn't operate on a strict timeline. There were months, sometimes years, between the killings early on. Then, as time went on, his frenzy escalated, his attacks growing more frequent, more theatrical, as if he was becoming addicted to the violence. One of the investigators, Detective Mark Reynolds, remarked in an interview years later, "It's like he craved recognition, or validation. His actions weren't just about taking a life, they were about making a statement. He wanted us to know he was here. He wanted us to feel powerless." The public, meanwhile, was spiraling into panic and paranoia. Conspiracy theories mushroomed in every direction, fueled by a media landscape hungry for drama and fear. Some whispered that this Night Predator was part of a satanic cult, killing his victims as sacrifices. Others spun wild narratives of a government-trained operative gone rogue, unwilling to let their imagination acknowledge the more likely, unsettling truth. This wasn't some extraordinary villain. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, hiding in plain sight. One of the most chilling aspects of his crimes was his ability to adapt. As the police ramped up their scrutiny of Elm Street, setting up surveillance and questioning anyone who passed through at odd hours, the night predator didn't stop. He merely changed his approach. Gone were the bodies left in dumpsters, abandoned lots, and alleyways. Instead, new victims began turning up farther and farther away from Elm Street. Their strangled, mutilated remains appeared in rivers, forested hiking trails, and dilapidated barns. It was as though he knew exactly how close they were getting, and how to stay just one step ahead. And then there were the strange signatures he left behind. The killer never directly communicated with the media or the authorities, but subtle, sinister trademarks started to emerge. One family reported finding an anonymous letter the day after their loved one's death, written in sharp, blocky handwriting with the words, "She was no angel, the hunt continues." Another victim's body was found clutching a single white feather in her hand, a symbol that detectives debated endlessly but never fully deciphered. More troubling still were the scattered rumors of his return to the scenes of his crimes. A woman walking her dog claimed she saw a man standing under the flickering streetlight of an empty alley, where one of the victims had been found weeks earlier. He wore a hooded jacket and didn't move, just stared as she hurried away. When police arrived minutes later, the man, and all evidence he might have left behind, was gone. As the mystery deepened, so too did its impact on Elm Street residents. People locked their doors earlier. Women stopped walking alone at night. The usual rhythm of life in the neighborhood was replaced by an oppressive undercurrent of fear. But perhaps the most insidious damage inflicted by the night predator wasn't just on his victims or their grieving families. It was the wedge he drove through the heart of this struggling community, forcing it to confront its own neglect, its apathy, and the way it had turned a blind eye to its most vulnerable inhabitants for far too long. Who was the night predator? Was he the betrayed lover of one of his victims, a drifter cursed with an unquenchable thirst for violence? Or was he, as some suspected, simply an ordinary man driven to extraordinary darkness by the weight of his own demons? The terrifying truth remained out of reach for years, but one thing was certain: whoever he was, the night predator knew his battlefield inside and out. Elm Street was more than just his hunting ground, it was his stage. And until the curtain finally fell on his theater of horrors, the people of Elm Street would live in the long shadow of a man they couldn't see, but who never stopped watching. The victims, exploiting the vulnerable. They weren't nameless, faceless shadows, though society had long treated them as such. The women who fell victim to the night predator were mothers, daughters, and sisters. They were human beings with lives tethered by hardship, forgotten by a world that seemed indifferent to their suffering. If life played favorites, these women certainly hadn't been among them. They weren't wealthy or powerful. They lacked safety nets, advocates, and in many cases, even a roof they could call their own. And it was this vulnerability, this raw and unguarded exposure, that made them such easy targets for someone lurking in the dark. Most of the victims were women who worked the streets of Elm Street under the shroud of anonymity. Many of them came from poverty-stricken backgrounds, torn between feeding their children and facing the harsh realities of homelessness. What choice did they have? The jobs they had once hoped might offer them stability had either evaporated or broken them under grueling hours at low wages. Strip away the stigma, and sex work became an act of survival, a way to keep their kids fed, their rent barely covered, their lives afloat. Maria Lopez was one such woman, a single mother of 2 young boys. She had come to the United States with dreams of a better future. A future where her sons wouldn't have to work in the fields like she had in Guatemala, breaking her back for pennies under the scorching sun. But dreams don't pay the bills, and as the reality of her husband's abandonment sunk in, Maria found herself on Elm Street. Her friends remembered her as hard-working and incredibly resourceful, her cheap lipstick and high heels just part of the armor she donned to protect herself from judgment and danger. When Maria vanished, it took weeks before anyone noticed. The landlady assumed she'd run off without paying the rent. Her customers simply moved on to the next face. And when her body finally resurfaced, no one seemed to mourn her lost dreams or wonder about the 2 orphaned children she left behind. Maria's story wasn't unique. There was Rachel Simmons, a young woman from Kansas with bright blue eyes that betrayed her naivete. She had left home at 17, escaping a mother hooked on pills and a string of stepfathers who thought silence was consent. Unlike many others, Rachel didn't plan to work the streets. She had aspirations of going to beauty school, of someday opening her own salon. But after losing what little money she had hitchhiking across the Midwest, Elm Street became her last resort. Rachel had been smiling that night, flashing her white teeth at every passing car, too new in the game to sense the predator circling her. Then there was Shauna Hayes, a former waitress who used to serve burgers and fries at a 24-hour diner downtown. She had lost her job when the place shut down after the new freeway exit siphoned off customers. Too desperate to return to her estranged family in Detroit, and unwilling to walk into a shelter full of prying eyes and empty promises, she turned to the one thing she swore she never would. Her first night on Elm Street, Shauna told a coworker she felt like crawling out of her own skin. "I'll kill myself if I have to do this too long," she'd said. Tragically, Shauna didn't have to make that decision herself. She vanished 3 months into the life she hated and was found brutally murdered weeks later. What tied these women together wasn't just how they died, it was how they lived. The majority were women society refused to see. They were immigrants too tired to hope, women escaping abusive partners, and runaway teens lured into Elm Street by traffickers who spun fairy tales about money and freedom. Some had been in and out of foster care, while others grew up in broken homes barren of love or opportunity. Their lack of support systems made them prey. But it wasn't just their lack of options that made them victims. It was the way society refused to care. For many, their murders wouldn't even be reported in mainstream media. If they were, it would be some hollow depiction with impersonal headlines like "Streetwalker Found Dead." The language stripped away their humanity, reducing their lives to a footnote in the lurid pages of local news. When reporters dared to call them by name, they often framed the women's deaths as inevitable, the grim result of a life on the wrong path, as if their choices made them disposable. These women's faces blurred into a broad stereotype of the poor and the invisible. To most, they weren't Maria, or Rachel or Shauna, they were simply women selling themselves. They were viewed as prostitutes before they were people, their deaths dissected more as cautionary tales than tragedies in their own right. Few thought to ask who loved them, who waited for them to come home, or what dreams they had set aside just to make it through today. The police too treated the initial disappearances with ambivalence at best, and disdain at worst. After all, it wasn't the mayor's daughter or a corporate executive lying lifeless in the weeds by the river. It wasn't some suburban mother whose smile had lit up holiday postcards. When someone like Maria vanished, the assumption was she had simply skipped town, ran off to avoid some debt, maybe even turned up dead due to her lifestyle choices. There was no urgency to investigate or connect the dots between missing persons, and so, the night predator thrived in this blind spot. He understood that society's prejudice worked in his favor. To him, these women were less than human. They were his justification, his excuse. He called himself a savior, rationalizing that his acts were cleansing Elm Street of its filth. In his twisted mind, he thought he was correcting something about the world. To everyone else, he was a monster exploiting the overlooked for his own sick pleasure. Even as the bodies began to pile up, voices advocating for the women grew louder. Grassroots activists demanded accountability and dignity for the victims. They staged candlelight vigils on Elm Street, holding signs that bore names and photos of each woman lost, refusing to let them vanish without acknowledgement. The battle cry was simple. They mattered. They were people. But for every person holding a candle on Elm Street, there were still 2 or 3 shaking their heads in judgment. "What did they expect? It's how that life ends," muttered one man passing by. And it was this societal indifference, the unwillingness to look deeper, that made it so easy for the night predator to continue his spree, victimizing those who carried not just the weight of their own struggles, but the crushing burden of being invisible to the world around them. The modus operandi, when evil exceeds imagination. The more the authorities examined the details of his crimes, the more it became clear that the night predator didn't simply kill his victims, he made a performance of it. His methodology wasn't just cold, it was calculated, ritualistic even, with each crime escalating in brutality and depravity. Every victim carried the scars of his twisted imagination, each death a reminder of how far human darkness could stretch. This wasn't the work of someone simmering in rage, this was a killer who curated every moment of his crime scenes like they were grotesque works of art. For the night predator, murder was never just the endgame. The acts of violence themselves revealed layers of his psyche, his need for control, his craving for fear, and his unnerving desire to communicate. Each time the police peeled back the curtain on his crimes, they were left with more questions than answers, baffled by the sheer malevolence of his methods. The lure. how he chose his victims. Investigators believed that most of his victims were approached while they were alone, isolated, vulnerable, and perhaps already accustomed to an environment of risk. Working the unforgiving streets of Elm, these women were used to guarding against the occasional abusive customer, but what the night predator offered was different. Witness accounts from those who survived, or narrowly escaped, described him as disturbingly unremarkable. He didn't lead with aggression or aggression-tinged charm. Instead, he exuded calm, presenting himself as a reliable, harmless man with a quiet demeanor. He often offered them more money than they were used to receiving, enough to lower their guards, swirl possibilities of security, even if just for one night. Some reports suggested he drove a nondescript vehicle, possibly an old sedan or a pickup truck, blending perfectly in the sea of anonymity that defined Elm Street. There was nothing overtly alarming until it was too late. The capture. Fear as a weapon. Once he lured his victims into his trap, he didn't just kill them outright, he enslaved them in a horrifying psychological game. Many of the recovered bodies showed evidence of prolonged captivity. Rope burns around wrists and ankles. Bruises consistent with daily torture. Autopsy reports often confirm that some victims were kept alive for days or even weeks before meeting their end. Profilers described his strategy as breaking the will of his victims, turning them from desperate survivors into utterly helpless prey. His torture wasn't purely physical, it was deeply psychological too. One survivor, who narrowly escaped, described the horrifying patience of her captor. He didn't kill right away, it was worse than that. He let you think you might survive. Until he didn't. The kill, brutality, with a purpose. The cause of death varied between his victims, but one thing remained consistent. The violence wasn't impulsive. It was planned. Some were strangled with a coarse rope that left blistered bruises around their necks and gashes in their skin. Others suffered blunt force trauma, the fractures suggesting repeated blows with a blunt object. The medical examiners noted signs of beating so intense that it appeared rage fueled every strike, but the precision of his actions contradicted that conclusion. This wasn't someone losing control, it was someone wielding control with terrifying discipline. And then there were the deliberate forms of mutilation. One victim was found with her fingernails ripped off, each one meticulously removed as if it followed some kind of ritual. Another showed evidence of burns covering her lower legs and arms. In some cases, mysterious symbols were carved into their skin, jagged, angular scratches that detectives tried but failed to decode. These marks weren't random, they were deliberate, purposeful, a silent message from the killer to the world. The crime scene, messages left behind. The way he positioned his victims after the murders also hinted at his intentions. He didn't leave them where they fell, nor did he attempt to hide them. Instead, their bodies were often staged, arranged so that whoever found them wouldn't forget the scene anytime soon. Women were tied to fences with duct tape or left sprawled in alleys positioned unnaturally, their limbs contorted in ways that sent waves of unease through even the most seasoned investigators. One victim was found clutching a single white feather in her left hand, while another's mutilated body was surrounded by crushed cigarette packs. To the police, these elements seemed like taunts, hints that he wanted his work noticed, dissected, puzzled over. "He wanted us to see the poetry of it," said Detective Mark Reynolds during a press conference years later. To him, the staging wasn't just part of the crime, it was the crime. Patterns of escalation, evolving violence. At first, his murders were spaced out, a few months between each victim, sometimes more than a year, but as the years went by, his killings became more frequent, the time between them shortening until it felt like he was moving on a schedule only he understood. Investigators speculated that this reflected a growing addiction to the horrific rush of dominance. What began as simple strangulations eventually devolved into nightmarish brutality. His victims didn't just die, some were subjected to methods designed to inflict humiliation, as if to rob them of whatever dignity they had retained amid their struggles. The survivors who saw what he was capable of spoke of their escape not as luck, but as near miracles. Signature calling cards, disturbing details. His calling cards became a detective's nightmare. They were specific but bizarre, a fusion of random objects and cryptic gestures that made any pattern difficult to track. Feathers, specific brands of cigarettes, cryptic shapes scratched into the dirt, overly symbolic placement of the body, all of it added layers to his crimes that made investigators question what he was trying to say. One of the most confounding elements was the occasional letter left at crime scenes. Written in blocky handwriting, they carried chillingly short phrases like, "She was no angel or better the devil than her." These weren't just notes, they were statements, twisted proclamations of his worldview. Forensic linguists were brought in to analyze the notes, but they could only hypothesize about the killer's motives: hatred for women in general, rage born from personal failures, or a sociopath enjoying the game. Fear and control, his ultimate weapons. By the time the media settled on calling him the Night Predator, his grip on the community was suffocating. Everyone in and around Elm Street felt his shadow. People avoided walking alone, and women working the streets started carrying makeshift weapons or traveling together. But none of it mattered. Fear was his greatest weapon, not just fear in his victims but in the community he terrorized. He thrived on the chaos he created, watching as people attempted to make themselves feel safe, while knowing deep down that nothing could truly protect them. Every time the police thought they could pin him down, he adapted, staying one step ahead like he was playing chess on a board only he could see. Final thoughts. A method, befitting a monster. The Night Predator didn't need to justify his actions. His crimes spoke that language for him, painted in blood and pain. He was a man who didn't just commit murder, he orchestrated terror. His methods were as much psychological warfare as physical brutality. And to the people of Elm Street, each death didn't just tell a story of personal loss, it left scars on an entire community still struggling to untangle itself from the nightmare he built. The scattered clues, tire tracks and used motor oil. In every case involving a serial predator, there comes a point when investigators stop looking for the smoking gun and start piecing together dozens of small scattered clues. That's where the Elm Street case had landed in 1996 as a sense of dread and frustration settled over the task force. Despite months of investigations, countless interviews, and endless hours of surveillance, they didn't have a name, a face, or even a clear motive. What they did have, however, was evidence, small, seemingly unrelated fragments of a puzzle that hinted at something bigger, and for the Night Predator, two of the most peculiar but recurring breadcrumbs came in the form of tire tracks and used motor oil. The first clue surfaced several weeks into the investigation, when officers discovered the second body behind the hardware store. Amid the chaos of processing the scene, photographing the brutally staged victim and scouring the area for signs of the killer, someone noticed odd, deeply embedded tire tracks in the muddy alleyway behind the dumpsters. They didn't match the types of tires commonly seen on passenger vehicles or sedans used throughout Elm Street. Instead, they appeared to belong to a larger, rugged vehicle, possibly a pickup truck or a light-duty box truck. What stood out wasn't just the size of the tracks, but their condition. The tires were heavily worn down, suggesting they were well past their lifespan, bald in places with uneven treads that indicated heavy use over many years. Cast molds were made, and after comparing the unique wear patterns with databases of tire types, investigators narrowed it down to a specific make and model used predominantly for utility vehicles. This clue didn't tell them much, but it told them something. The killer potentially drove a utility vehicle, one large enough to blend in among service workers and delivery drivers, ensuring his movements would go unnoticed. Several weeks later, after the fifth body of the Night Predator was discovered near a remote hiking trail, detectives found traces of an unusual black residue on the victim's clothing. At first it was written off as mud from the riverside, but under chemical analysis, it was determined to be heavily oxidized motor oil, used oil, to be precise. This wasn't the type of fresh motor oil found in bottles at auto shops, but the burned-out remnants that accumulate after thousands of miles of engine wear. It was thick, greasy, and carried with it trace elements of fuel contaminants. Such a substance didn't naturally occur at the hiking trail where the body had been deposited. This suggested two possibilities. Either the killer's vehicle had some sort of mechanical issue such as a leaky engine or improperly disposed motor oil, or, more disturbingly, he had brought the oil with him intentionally. What would compel someone to bring used motor oil to a crime scene? Was it accidental contamination, or was it another one of his macabre signatures meant to muddy the investigation while adding an extra layer of mystique to his crimes? Whatever the reasoning, the connection between the oil and the killer began to solidify when forensic teams revisited the earlier crime scenes. Trace amounts of similar substances had been present at two other locations, though they hadn't been flagged at the time due to the overwhelming presence of other forms of debris, such as shattered glass and construction refuse. The theory began to form that the killer quite possibly had a profession connected to vehicles, perhaps a truck driver, a mechanic, or someone experienced in automotive repair. Alternatively, he might have been using a vehicle that had been modified or repurposed for convenience in his crimes. Utility vehicles with compartments, hidden spaces, or industrial-grade features would offer the perfect cover, allowing him to transport his victims undetected while blending seamlessly into the background of the workaday streets of Elm. But the killer's cunning wasn't to be underestimated. Just as this theory began gaining traction among the investigators, it started to feel like he was intentionally mocking their efforts. Tire tracks turned up at some subsequent scenes, but they didn't always match the original mold samples taken in the early days of the investigation, suggesting the killer either switched vehicles or was deliberately faking evidence to mislead them. The study of used motor oil offered a similarly maddening trail. When analysts began examining the makeup of the oil residue, they noticed the contaminants varied slightly from scene to scene, suggesting multiple sources. This led to another haunting possibility. Perhaps the killer worked around multiple vehicles or had access to a site where industrial waste was common. The ability to casually spread those contaminants without a second thought would be second nature to someone familiar with garages, trucking depots, or even auto salvage yards. What made the discovery of the oil even more chilling was the implication it carried about the killer's process. This wasn't just someone acting impulsively. To leave behind the same clues so consistently, whether by accident or by choice, spoke to a level of control and confidence that unnerved even the most experienced investigators. He wasn't just evading capture, he was taunting them, leaving just enough evidence to keep them guessing but never enough to get close. The lead investigator on the case, Detective Mark Reynolds, later shared in an interview, "It was like he wanted us to know he was out there, always a step ahead of us. That oil, those tracks, they weren't mistakes, they were breadcrumbs. He was daring us to follow the trail, but no matter how close we thought we were, he slipped away." As the investigation deepened, detectives started focusing on local automotive businesses and trucking operations in and around Elm Street. They began conducting interviews with mechanics, delivery drivers, and service workers, questioning anyone whose job remotely matched the profile. But Elm, being an area where most businesses operated on shoestring budgets, had its fair share of unlicensed, off-the-books operations, and not everyone was willing to cooperate with law enforcement, adding another barrier to their progress. The scattered clues of tire tracks and motor oil seemed to dance just beyond the reach of comprehension. Were they valuable pieces of evidence, breadcrumbs leading to the killer's identity, or were they misdirection from a criminal who found satisfaction in sowing chaos even after the act was done? For all their theorizing, what investigators didn't yet realize was just how closely those tracks and that oil defined the man they hunted. Whether through intention or unintended carelessness, they painted a faint portrait of his movements, his habits, and his tools of terror. They just didn't know how to connect all the dots yet, and while the investigators struggled to decipher the puzzle made of tracks in the mud and oil stains on fabric, the night predator drove on, taking refuge in the blind spots of a world that failed to see its most vulnerable, and failed to notice the vehicle parked in plain sight. The breakthrough, the testimony of a survivor. Every dark story has a moment when a sliver of light cuts through the shadows, something that changes the entire course of an investigation. For the Elm Street case, that moment came when someone survived. Until that point, the night predator seemed invincible, almost supernatural, a monster lurking in the cracks of a dying community. No one had seen him, no one had lived to speak of him. But all of that changed one cold night in early 1997, when a young woman named Emily Carter clawed her way back from the brink of becoming his next victim. Emily wasn't new to danger. At just 23, she had already seen more of life's cruelty than most people experience in a lifetime. A runaway at 15, she drifted from one city to another, chasing promises of stability that always seemed just out of reach. By the time she arrived in Elm Street, she wasn't living, she was surviving. Night after night she stood under the broken glow of the streetlights, selling smiles to men whose names she never cared to learn. Each day bled into the next until that one fateful encounter. Emily recalls the night vividly, her voice shaking even years later as she recounts the details. "He wasn't like the others," she said during her testimony. "He wasn't drunk or pushy, just polite. Too polite now that I think about it. The kind of polite that makes you feel safe, and that's how he got me." The man had offered her $500. an amount high enough to make anyone on Elm Street ignore their instincts. You don't think. Not when the rent is overdue and you're hungry and you know you can't afford to say no, Emily admitted. She climbed into his truck, the kind of vehicle so nondescript it faded into the background. A dirty old utility truck whose passenger seat smelled faintly of oil and smoke. At first, things seemed normal. He drove, keeping the conversation casual, asking about her work, her life. But as they reached the outskirts of the city, Emily's stomach began to tighten. The familiar sights of Elm started to fade, replaced by dark, empty roads leading out to the woods. She asked where they were going, her voice light but betraying her growing unease. That's when his demeanor shifted. In a moment, the polite facade dissolved, replaced by something cold, almost robotic. "You'll see," he muttered under his breath. Before she could react, he pulled off onto a deserted dirt road, the headlights illuminating a small, rotted-out shack. Fear gripped her as he turned off the ignition and let silence hang heavily in the air. "I knew then," Emily said, her voice cracking. "I knew I wasn't going to make it out of there alive unless I did something." He grabbed her arm as she tried to open the door, yanking her back with terrifying strength. The next 2 hours were a blur of horror for Emily. Bound with coarse rope and gagged, she was dragged inside the shack. There, the true depravity of the night predator became apparent. The tools of his brutality were laid out neatly along a workbench, knives gleaming under the pale light of a single overhead bulb. Pliers, duct tape, and small unmarked bottles of liquid that gave off a pungent chemical smell. Emily wept silently as he seemed to prepare himself, humming an off-tune melody that made her stomach churn. He wasn't rushed, Emily recalled. He was enjoying it, like he had all the time in the world. But Emily wasn't ready to die. She noticed as he moved about the room that his focus wasn't entirely on her. Perhaps his confidence made him careless, or maybe he didn't think she had the strength to fight back. Either way, when he stepped briefly into an adjoining room to retrieve something, she took her chance. Using the sharp edge of a rusted nail protruding from the chair, she began to cut at the rope binding her wrists. It felt like an eternity, each scrape of the nail tearing into her skin as well, but finally, she loosened the knot just enough to slip one hand free. When he returned, holding one of the gleaming knives, she acted on pure instinct. She grabbed the nearest object, a broken piece of wood from the chair, and swung wildly. The blow startled him more than it hurt him, but it was enough. As he stumbled back, she bolted out of the shack, barefoot and bloodied, running into the freezing woods. "I didn't look back," she said. "I just ran. Branches tore at my arms, my feet felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't stop." She finally found a road and flagged down a passing truck driver who immediately called the police. By the time authorities reached the shack, the night predator was gone, along with any trace of evidence that might have identified him. Despite their frustration at missing the chance to catch him, Emily's testimony gave investigators their first real insight into how he operated. She described him as a white man in his late 30s or early 40s, with short sandy brown hair and piercing blue eyes that felt devoid of emotion. He wore plain, functional clothing, a flannel shirt and jeans, and walked with an unsettling, purposeful calm. But the detail that stood out most was the tattoo. On his forearm, just beneath the edge of his rolled-up sleeve, she caught a brief glimpse of an eagle, its wings spread wide. It was a small detail but significant. The tattoo became a key identifying feature as investigators began to widen their net, cross-referencing local records of individuals with criminal backgrounds, and tattoos of eagles. Emily's escape also inspired renewed efforts among the task force to find the killer. Her courage galvanized the community, sparking outrage and compassion in equal measure. Vigils were held in honor of the women who hadn't been as fortunate as Emily, and for the first time, the voices of Elm Street's forgotten were heard beyond their crumbling neighborhood. But for all the progress her survival brought, Emily bore the scars of her encounter with the night predator, long after the bruises faded. She lived in fear, constantly looking over her shoulder, haunted by the blue eyes and polite voice of the man who had nearly claimed her life. "He's still out there," she whispered in one interview, her hands trembling. "And I know he's watching, waiting." Emily Carter's survival wasn't the end of the night predator, but it was the beginning of his undoing. Thanks to her strength and ability to fight back, investigators gained the smallest thread to hold onto, a thread they hoped to pull until the entire facade of the night predator unraveled. The unveiling, an ordinary and terrifying man. They always say monsters don't hide, they blend in. And in the case of the night predator, that proved to be chillingly true. After years of lurking in the shadows, preying on society's most vulnerable and eluding police at every turn, his unmasking was as surreal as it was sobering. He wasn't an otherworldly figure or some twisted genius operating on a wavelength the world couldn't understand. No, the man behind the horrific crimes was painfully ordinary. William Hayes, a 42-year-old truck driver, suburban neighbor, and pillar of mundane predictability. William Hayes wasn't the kind of man you'd look at twice. Clean-shaven, average height, stocky yet nondescript, with unassuming sandy brown hair and eyes that seemed to avoid contact more out of shyness than anything else. He wore the kind of jeans and flannel shirts that every other working man in Elm Street seemed to own. No one would have thought twice if they saw him at a hardware store or pumping gas at the local station. That was his edge. His ordinariness made him invisible. The ordinary facade. William lived alone in a modest, single-level house just 3 miles from Elm Street. His neighbors described him as nice enough. He'd wave from his porch while drinking a beer, offer to lend a tool if you needed it, and sometimes mow the shared strip of grass between houses without being asked. He was far from someone people would associate with violence or depravity. Colleagues knew him as dependable. He worked long hours for a local logistics company, hauling goods across state lines in his beat-up truck. Fellow drivers often joked about how boring he was, never one to join in on bar nights or truck stop gossip. He'd sit in his cab during breaks, softly humming to himself or jotting notes into a pocket-sized journal. Socially, he was withdrawn but not entirely isolated. William had mastered the art of interacting just enough to avoid suspicion but not enough to leave lasting impressions. For years this facade worked perfectly. When police questioned him early on, along with dozens of other local men during their interviews, he appeared puzzled but polite. He didn't fit the profile of a predator in any obvious way. There were no past criminal charges, no signs of financial troubles, no outbursts of anger or antisocial behavior. He was just another face in the crowd, and for William Hayes, that was by design. Predators survive by being invisible, said Detective Mark Reynolds when discussing Hayes in an interview years later. Most people assume serial killers are these eccentric, brooding misfits, but the truth is they're your neighbor, the guy at the grocery store, the driver delivering your package. That was William Hayes. He was perfect at playing the part of nobody. The breaking point. The breakthrough in the case ultimately came from Emily Carter's survival and testimony, which gave investigators the first piece of identifying information about Hayes, the eagle tattoo on his forearm. That detail prompted detectives to cross-reference tattoo licensing records, parole files, and criminal backgrounds in surrounding counties. It wasn't long before William Hayes' name appeared on their radar. Though he had no criminal record, his tattoos matched the description Emily offered, and his job as a long-haul truck driver fit the profile of someone who could move victims long distances undetected. But what sealed Hayes' fate was his vehicle. The investigators, already piecing together tire track evidence across crime scenes, noticed that cast patterns from multiple sites matched the wheels of a truck linked to Hayes' company. His particular route log showed him repeatedly passing through areas where victims had been abducted or where bodies were found. It was enough to justify a search warrant, leading authorities to his home. What they discovered behind the closed doors of that unassuming house sent shockwaves through Elm Street, and through law enforcement agencies tasked with unraveling this nightmare of a case, the revelations. The inside of Hayes' house spoke volumes about the monster lurking beneath his mundane exterior. It wasn't the grisly, blood-splattered scene that horror movies portray. Instead, the house was meticulously clean. On the surface, it looked ordinary. A well-worn couch, a coffee table with empty beer bottles, and a dusty shelf lined with sports trophies from his high school days. But in the basement, the mask finally cracked. The basement was a shrine to his crimes. Investigators found a small, locked room, concealed behind a false panel in the wall. Inside there were the tools of his trade. Restraints, utility knives, duct tape, pliers, and unmarked bottles of chemicals whose purpose remains unclear. Most harrowing of all were the trophies, pieces of jewelry, bobby pins, and small handwritten notes, presumably taken from his victims. He had even saved locks of hair, stored in small, carefully labeled plastic bags. In one chilling discovery, police unearthed a diary. But it wasn't the kind of diary one keeps to write down mundane activities or fleeting thoughts. This was a journal of meticulous planning and reflection, documenting at least 15 murders over a span of 5 years. Each entry included details about the victim, their appearance, where he found them, how he captured them, and, disturbingly, what he thought about them before and after the act. In some entries, Hayes referred to himself without using his name, writing instead, "The predator feeds," or "The streets are quiet tonight, but I'm listening." In another room, evidence linking him to multiple crime scenes was found. Traces of used motor oil and shoes covered in dried mud matched samples found at 2 different bodies' disposal sites. Cast molds of his truck's tires, heavily worn down from years on the road, definitively linked him to the patterns found near several murder scenes. The man behind the mask. But what drove this man to commit acts of such unspeakable horror? To his neighbors and colleagues, Hayes was boring. To investigators, he was the embodiment of evil wrapped in normalcy. His childhood raised some red flags. Born to a working-class family, Hayes grew up in a small Midwestern town. His father, an abusive alcoholic, was known to beat both him and his mother, instilling patterns of violence and control from an early age. Teachers described him as quiet but capable, though one recalled his unnerving tendency to write violent stories during classroom assignments. In one chilling anecdote, an elementary school counselor noted that Hayes sometimes spoke about animals with an emotionless curiosity. He didn't want to pet the dog, the counselor said. He wanted to know how it worked, how it would break. I'll never forget the way he described it. Investigators believe his lifelong resentment toward authority, rejection from women, and a need for control fueled his descent into the calculated monster he became. Hayes never married, never formed close relationships, and spent most of his time on the road, where isolation allowed his dark fantasies to fester unchecked. A predator unmasked. When police arrested Hayes outside his home on a chilly autumn morning, he went quietly. There was no dramatic standoff, no tearful confession. He simply watched the officers surrounding him with unsettling calm, offering nothing but a thin, almost polite smile. Underneath his work jacket, the faded eagle tattoo was visible just as Emily Carter had described. In court, Hayes initially denied the charges, calling them fabrications by police eager for a scapegoat. But as evidence mounted, tire tracks, journals, trophies, DNA, he crumbled. He eventually confessed to the murders, saying the women he targeted were weak and that their deaths gave him a sense of cleansing. They didn't matter to anyone else, he remarked coldly during one of his interrogations. They barely mattered to themselves. The legacy William Hayes shocked the world not because he was extraordinary, but because he wasn't. He wasn't the masked boogeyman of campfire tales or the suave, manipulative genius of psychological thrillers. He was a man who lived in the open, whose greatest weapon was his ability to make people underestimate him. His capture may have ended his years-long reign of terror, but it left scars on the women of Elm Street and a devastating question hanging in the air. How many other William Hayes are out there, blending in, waiting for the moment when no one notices them slipping away into the dark? The interrogation and the shocking confession. When William Hayes was finally taken into custody, the air in the interrogation room was thick with tension. Detectives had spent years chasing shadows, sifting through horrific scenes, and listening to the anguished cries of families who would never see their loved ones again. Now, the man they believed to be the night predator sat calmly in front of them, as ordinary as the neighbor who mows your lawn or the guy who fixes your dishwasher. This mundane exterior was the exact reason why the room felt so charged. Behind the boredom of his appearance lurked a man capable of unimaginable horrors. Hayes didn't resist during his arrest, didn't demand a lawyer immediately, and didn't break into the kind of rage or theatrics often depicted in shows about serial killers. No, William Hayes was polite. He offered no fight, no rage. He simply accepted the cups of coffee offered to him by the detectives, glanced at the tape recorder on the table, and waited. There was something unnerving about how quiet he was, how ###1. The interrogation, and a shocking confession. When William Hayes was finally escorted into the police interrogation room, it marked the first time that law enforcement could come face to face with the man who had terrorized the Elm Street community for years. It wasn't the grand showdown they might have expected, though. The man they arrested was calm, eerily composed, and even banal in his demeanor. In the eyes of many investigators, there lay nothing extraordinary about the man sitting across the table, shackled by handcuffs. Yet beneath his steely calm was a mind capable of unspeakable darkness, and they were about to learn just how deeply it ran. Detective Mark Reynolds, who had been with the case since uncovering the very first body, described the interrogation as one of the most unnerving experiences of his career. He didn't act broken, Reynolds later said in an interview. There was no fear, no anger, no remorse. Hayes sat there like he was waiting for a doctor's appointment, polite but utterly detached. It was like he was watching the whole thing happen from outside his own body. At first Hayes refused to speak. The two detectives who interrogated him, Reynolds included, began with soft questions trying to ease him into a confession. They asked about his truck routes, his job at the logistics company, and rumors from colleagues who found him odd. Hayes answered these questions curtly, providing just enough information to sound cooperative without truly giving anything away. But as the conversation shifted toward the evidence, tire tracks, the motor oil, and most damningly the journal, the facade started to crack, though not the way they expected. Reluctant, but in control. When detectives first presented Hayes with photos of the victims, hoping to provoke an emotional reaction, they were met with nothing but calculated silence. Hayes leaned back a little in his chair, as though he were studying the images, tilting his head slightly, his eyes lingering just long enough to suggest familiarity, but not guilt. When asked, "Do you know these women?" he responded with a flat, emotionless, "No." The detectives pressed harder, laying out the case piece by piece. They walked him through the discoveries, the tire tracks matching his truck, the chemical profile of the motor oil linked to his vehicle, and the journal, a treasure trove of depraved details so specific that even the most seasoned officers felt uneasy reading it. Hayes showed no outward emotion as they presented these pieces of evidence, merely staring at them with the curiosity of an onlooker rather than the terror of a man caught red-handed. His response to the journal was especially chilling. When Reynolds slid it across the table, Hayes flipped through a few pages with a faint smile, as though he'd stumbled upon an old book he vaguely remembered liking. "You're very thorough," he said quietly, his lip curling into what could only be described as an inappropriate smirk. "William, why did you do it?" Reynolds asked after an hour of dead ends. The room fell silent for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a faint shrug, Hayes finally broke his silence. "They made it easy." It was the first time his voice carried even a hint of pride, and as the detectives pressed him to clarify, his confession began to slowly, horrifyingly unravel. The verdict and the end. When William Hayes stood in court, shackled in his dull orange prison jumpsuit, the room was silent. For years, he had haunted Elm Street like an invisible specter, a ghostly presence that took lives in the darkness and left broken families in the light. But now, stripped of the anonymity of shadows, the faces of his victims no longer nameless, his reckoning had come. The trial of the night predator not only exposed his heinous crimes, but also revealed the failure of a society that allowed him to thrive in plain sight. The case was one of the most highly publicized in recent memory, drawing media attention from all corners of the country. News networks dissected every revelation from the trial like vultures pecking at a carcass. The courtroom, packed wall to wall with victims' families, journalists, and community members, became a theater of justice. The families showed up with photos of loved ones clutched tightly in their hands, images of smiling, vibrant women who never lived to tell their stories. For them, this was more than a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning, a trial that gripped the nation. From the very beginning, Hayes's defense team faced an insurmountable battle. The prosecutors had mountains of evidence, from tire tracks to forensic matches of motor oil, from the damning journal entries to trophies collected from the victims. DNA evidence further solidified the state's case as samples recovered from Hayes's truck and his basement matched several of his victims. The journal alone read like a grotesque novel, describing in chilling detail his thoughts, feelings, and precise methods for isolating and killing his victims. Then there was the emotional testimony from survivors like Emily Carter. Walking into the courtroom to testify, Emily carried her trauma with a quiet but heavy determination. The courtroom hung on her every word as she recounted the night she escaped his clutches, her voice trembling but unwavering. "He wanted to own me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He smiled like it didn't matter, like I didn't matter, but I survived, and I'm here to make sure every one of those women gets justice." The defense, desperate for a foothold, presented Hayes's troubled upbringing as a mitigating factor. His attorneys painted a portrait of a man scarred by years of physical abuse from an alcoholic father and an emotionally absent mother. "What you see before you is a broken man," one of his lawyers argued, "not a born monster, but someone driven to darkness by circumstances beyond his control." But like a faulty defense mechanism, this attempt fell apart under the weight of Hayes's actions. The prosecution argued persuasively that Hayes's childhood struggles, however tragic, could not excuse the calculated sadistic murders of more than a dozen women. The defining moment came when Hayes himself took the stand. Against every piece of advice from his legal team, he requested to address the court. His demeanor, much like during his interrogation, was eerily detached. There was no remorse, no apology. Instead, what he offered was cold, analytical, and callous. "They were invisible," Hayes said, his voice so calm it sent chills through the room. "Nobody cared about them. You think anyone came looking for those women? Nobody did. Until now. If I hadn't done what I did, they would have just disappeared anyway. So what's the difference?" The gasps that followed his statement echoed through the courtroom. For many families in attendance, Hayes's words weren't just gut-wrenching, they were an erasure of their loved one's humanity. It was in that moment that the full weight of his monstrosity became undeniable to everyone present. The sentence. After weeks of trial testimony, arguments, and evidence, it all came to a close. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours, a brief but powerful signal of the overwhelming case against him. When the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict, the tension in the courtroom was suffocating. "On the charge of first-degree murder," the foreperson began, "we find the defendant, William Hayes, guilty." The word guilty was repeated 14 more times, representing each known victim. Tears flowed from the gallery, and audible sighs of relief rippled through the room. But for many of the victims' families, justice tasted bittersweet. Their loved ones were gone, and not even Hayes's conviction could fill the void they left behind. At the sentencing hearing, Hayes was sentenced to death. The judge's words were stern but resolute. "William Hayes, your actions were not just evil. They were calculated, deliberate acts meant to rob people of their dignity, their safety, and their lives. You preyed on the most vulnerable in society and sought to extinguish their light. This court sentences you to the maximum penalty under the law, death." A community's reckoning. For the Elm Street community, the trial may have provided a sense of closure, but the damage Hayes inflicted could not be undone. People still whispered about the years he had spent terrorizing their streets, hiding in plain sight. His calculated cruelty forced the community to face uncomfortable truths, not just about the predator in their midst, but about the way society had failed his victims long before he took their lives. There was anger, not just at Hayes, but at the system that had let these women slip through the cracks. Neighborhoods like Elm Street, marked by poverty, transient populations, and neglect, became easy hunting grounds for someone like Hayes precisely because society had chosen to look away. His victims were women society had ignored: sex workers, immigrants, single mothers, and runaways. They were labeled expendable before they ever encountered Hayes. In the aftermath, grassroots organizations sprouted in Elm Street and surrounding areas, aiming to provide support for vulnerable women. Outreach programs offered resources, counseling, job placement, and housing assistance for those in high-risk circumstances. Vigils were held annually to honor Hayes's victims, not just as a remembrance of those lost, but as a declaration that their lives mattered. What comes after? For Hayes, life on death row was a far cry from the control he'd once wielded in his basement. There, surrounded by murders, sociopaths, and the echoes of his own deeds, he became just another prisoner awaiting the inevitable. Though appeals and procedural delays stretched out his execution date, the verdict never wavered. William Hayes would one day pay the ultimate price for his crimes. But for the families of his victims, no sentence could undo the devastation he wrought. For them, closure wasn't found in Hayes's punishment. It came in the small but meaningful ways they chose to honor their loved ones. Maria Gonzalez's family started a scholarship in her name for immigrant women pursuing higher education. Rachel Simmons's younger brother became an advocate for runaway teens. And for Emily Carter, the survivor who broke the case wide open, justice meant making sure no one else endured what she had. She became a public speaker, sharing her story with raw honesty, ensuring the world remembered what the night predator had tried to erase. A final word. The case of William Hayes was more than the story of a serial killer. It was a grim reminder that monsters like him often exist in the blind spots of neglect and apathy. His capture and conviction may have marked the end of a terrifying chapter, but the lessons he left behind will linger far longer. Elm Street will never forget his darkness, but in time it may learn to stand in the light again. Public reaction. The forgotten people. The trial of William Hayes, the monster behind the mask of the Night Predator, didn't just send shockwaves through the courtroom. It ignited a national conversation about who society protects, and more importantly, who it allows to slip through the cracks. For many, Hayes's horrors were not just a story about one predator. They were a brutal examination of the systemic failures that created the perfect playground for his crimes. The public's reaction was a mixture of outrage, heartbreak, and uncomfortable soul-searching about the treatment of the most vulnerable in America. From Elm Street to the national stage, Hayes's trial became a symbol of more than just justice for his victims. It became a mirror reflecting the deep societal neglect that had allowed him to operate unnoticed and unchallenged for years. A community in mourning for the Elm Street community, the trial felt like both a reckoning and an unhealed wound. Businesses shut their doors during key moments of the proceedings as residents huddled around TVs in diners, living rooms, and break rooms to watch the news coverage. The faces of Hayes's victims, women and young girls who had once roamed their streets, were now plastered across screens as journalists pieced together their lives. For many residents there was shame in those faces. Not shame for the lives the women had led, but shame within the community for having ignored them while they were alive. Murmurs of regret buzzed through the town during candlelight vigils. "I used to see Maria at the bus stop," a local resident admitted tearfully on camera. "I never spoke to her, but I saw her every day. I just assumed she had somewhere to go, something to leave for. Now I can't stop wondering what would have happened if I had reached out." It wasn't just Elm Street struggling with these realizations. Hayes's victims symbolized a much larger issue. The women he preyed on came from the margins of society, single mothers who worked 2 jobs but still couldn't cover the rent, immigrants who scraped together a living by any means necessary for a chance at the American dream, teens who had fled from broken homes, hitchhiking far enough away to wrongfully believe they had escaped their pain. They were the forgotten people, invisible and disposable in the eyes of a society that had failed them long before Hayes ever spotted them under the flickering streetlights. The community reckoned not only with what Hayes had done, but with the environment they had allowed to exist. "What kind of place lets this happen to their own?" a man lamented at a vigil for one of Hayes's victims. "We let people live in the shadows because it's easier not to see, easier not to know." National outcry. While Elm Street struggled with its grief and guilt, the rest of the country reacted with widespread outrage. Newspapers, podcasts, and TV roundtables debated the unsettling undertones of the case. Opinion pieces flooded national media outlets, pointing fingers at law enforcement, city officials, and the public at large. "William Hayes succeeded because we failed," wrote one prominent columnist in a scathing op-ed. "We failed by allowing neighborhoods like Elm Street to crumble under the weight of poverty and neglect. We failed by teaching ourselves to turn a blind eye to sex workers and runaways who don't fit into society. And worst of all, we failed the women who screamed for help long before their bodies were ever discovered." The case became a rallying cry for activists and advocates demanding systemic change. Non-profit organizations rolled out awareness campaigns, urging Americans to see sex workers and transient populations as people first, rather than as caricatures or statistics. Across social media, hashtags like #TheyMatter and #ForgottenNoMore trended as people shared thoughts, support, and resources. On college campuses, students held vigils with placards featuring victims' names and ages, forcing passers-by to confront their humanity in ways William Hayes had robbed them of. Missteps of law enforcement. Behind every headline about Hayes's atrocities came another equally haunting question: how was he not caught sooner? Investigations into Hayes revealed missed opportunities and systemic indifference on the part of authorities over the years. At the trial, the question repeatedly arose: had law enforcement paid closer attention to the early disappearances of women on Elm Street? Could lives have been saved? Local police faced sharp criticism for dismissing the majority of Hayes's victims as unworthy of thorough investigation. Often labeled as sex workers or transients, their missing persons reports, if filed at all, were met with vague reassurances and delayed follow-ups. "These women didn't vanish overnight," remarked Detective Mark Reynolds at an interview after the trial. "They disappeared one at a time, and it took too long for us to notice the pattern." The backlash toward police apathy fed into broader conversations about how society ranks the value of human life. Activists pointed out that if Hayes had targeted wealthy suburban housewives or college students, the response would likely have been immediate and unrelenting. But because his victims existed on the fringes, they were allowed to fade away without notice, until Hayes turned their disappearances into something too monstrous to ignore. Media and the burden of sensationalism. Throughout the trial, the media became both hero and villain. While their relentless coverage amplified the victims' stories and exposed the gross negligence that allowed Hayes to operate, it also often veered into sensationalism. Some headlines referred to the victims as prostitutes, rather than using their names, reducing their deaths to gruesome footnotes about their lifestyles. Others chose lurid language over human empathy, framing the women only as stereotypes of desperation. This kind of coverage reignited a long-standing debate about how society perceives victims from marginalized communities. Why were they still being dehumanized even in death? Activists and surviving family members pushed back hard against these narratives, demanding accountability for the language used to define those who had been lost. One moment that stood out came during a nationally broadcast interview with Rachel Simmons's younger brother Ben, who had grown up watching his sister struggle before she ended up on Elm Street. When the reporter casually referred to Rachel as a known sex worker, Ben's composed demeanor cracked. "She was my sister," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "She was someone who loved sunsets and could recite every line from her favorite movie. She babysat neighborhood kids for quarters when she was in high school. Don't reduce her to that. Don't make her less than who she was." A call for change. Perhaps the most extraordinary thing about Hayes' trial was the catalyst it became for change, both locally and nationally. Elm Street, the small corner of America that had been resigned to its cracks and shadows, became a symbol of what needed to change. Community organizations began springing up, offering hope in places where despair had silently grown for years. Nonprofits started targeting vulnerable populations directly, providing resources for sex workers and at-risk youth. Shelter programs expanded to include more outreach teams and less restrictive policies for women fleeing dangerous situations. "We can't control William Hayes," one local advocate said, "but we can make sure the next William Hayes doesn't find victims so easily." Congressional hearings emerged, with lawmakers urging states to rethink how they handle missing persons cases, especially when victims come from marginalized backgrounds. Campaigns formed around reforming police protocols, advocating for officers to abandon biases when investigating crimes involving sex workers. Grassroots organizations held workshops and wrote legislation aimed at ensuring no one, no matter their occupation, race, or circumstances, was treated as beyond saving. A stark reminder. In the end, the public reaction to William Hayes wasn't just about condemning him, it was about holding a mirror to the society that had allowed him to thrive. Hayes' crimes illuminated not only his own evil, but also the systemic neglect that so often makes predators like him possible. His victims were casualties of a culture that found it easier to dismiss, generalize, and ignore the people on the margins than to fight for their safety and dignity. As people placed flowers and candles at vigils for Hayes' victims, the sentiment written on one hand-drawn sign summed up the reckoning perfectly. They were not forgotten. We just refused to see them. It was a grim statement, a reminder that even as Hayes himself faded into the prisons of history, Elm Street's scars would take far longer to heal. The final reminder. Behind every courtroom verdict, behind every sensational news headline, and behind every vigil in memory of the victims, there is a lingering truth that society must face: the weight of failure. The case of William Hayes, the night predator, will forever remain a warning. Not because it revealed the existence of pure evil, but because it revealed how easily evil thrives when the world looks the other way. Some stories fade with time. Names blur, dates become statistics, and details lose their sharp edges. But the story of Hayes' victims refuses to vanish quietly. It was never just about the women he preyed on. It was about an entire system, an entire culture, that failed to protect those women long before he took their lives. The lessons of this case aren't locked in history books or limited to the archives of legal databases. They are living, breathing reminders of what happens when society dismisses its most vulnerable members. A society that turned away. William Hayes didn't operate in the dark corners of an underground world. He didn't hide behind a web of secrecy or complex disguises. He operated on Elm Street in plain sight in the very heart of a struggling community. He was a painter of fences, a driver of trucks, a man who mowed his lawn and nodded to neighbors who asked him about the weather. He was what the world, for all its voyeuristic curiosity, often finds most terrifying: an ordinary man. But he thrived in something more potent than shadows. He thrived in indifference. His victims were often labeled before they were seen: prostitutes, runaways, transients. These were not terms of humanity, they were terms of dismissal, descriptions designed not to honor a life but to diminish its value. To Hayes, they were prey. To the world, they were invisible. This invisibility didn't just shield William Hayes from detection, it enabled his horror. The neglect didn't start with the police dismissing early missing person reports, nor did it start with journalists framing these women as fallen rather than loved. It started with something more insidious, the quiet willingness of a society to decide which lives are worth saving and which can be ignored. Names, not statistics. Maria Gonzalez wasn't born a victim. She was a mother, a daughter, a dreamer who had come to America with promises in her heart and a future in her eyes. She wasn't defined by the streets of Elm Street. The streets were only where she landed when 1,000 tiny cracks in her life became too wide to cross. Rachel Simmons didn't first enter this world as a runaway. She knew safety once, even if it was fleeting, the smell of freshly baked cookies in her grandmother's kitchen, the sound of laughter in a Kansas cornfield where she played hide-and-seek as a child. The streets were never her destination. They were her last resort. For every victim Hayes silenced, there was a story the world stopped hearing long before it ended. The survivors, the family members, the people left staring at empty chairs at dinner tables, they're the ones who insist the stories stay alive. They demand that the world learn these lessons, keeping the names of loved ones on their lips so they don't dissolve into the fog of crime statistics. The lessons we cannot ignore. William Hayes's ability to carry out his crimes was rooted in more than his cunning or his cruelty. It was rooted in gaps in empathy, in attention, in enforcement. The world ###1, the final reminder. Behind every great tragedy lies a lesson that demands to be learned, etched into the fabric of history so the same horrors are never repeated. For Elm Street, and the case of William Hayes, the so-called night predator, the narrative didn't just end with a guilty verdict or a death sentence. It left behind a painful and profound reminder, one that continues to resonate long after Hayes disappeared into the abyss of the prison system. His atrocities forced a reckoning far greater than himself. It was a call to action for society to confront its failure to protect its own, particularly the vulnerable and forgotten. No monster, just a mirror. William Hayes stunned the world not because he was a larger-than-life villain, but because of how terrifyingly average he was. He wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in the depths of unlit alleys, draped in a menacing cloak. He wasn't a charismatic seducer who dazzled people into submission with his charm. He was a man who wore flannel shirts and drove a beat-up truck. He smiled at neighbors while mowing his lawn. He blended in. This ordinariness was his most dangerous weapon, but it was also what made the case so haunting. After all, if Hayes, a seemingly harmless, unremarkable individual, could be capable of such brutality, who else might be lurking undetected? He represented the banality of evil, existing in the blind spots of apathy and neglect. And while Hayes thrived on his ability to hide in plain sight, his real power came from the fact that no one had been watching. Not really. His victims weren't seen as worth protecting. They were women ignored by every safety net meant to catch them before they fell. Sex workers, immigrants, runaways, and single mothers, they were outsiders, invisible in a society that values the loud, the successful, and the conventional. Hayes didn't just exploit them, he exploited the world's indifference to them, the women we overlooked. The true tragedy of the William Hayes case wasn't just what he did, it was how easy he made it look. Hayes preyed on the forsaken corners of society, finding his victims among women who were already surviving on the razor's edge of existence. These women lived lives of desperation long before Hayes ever laid eyes on them. Many were struggling to feed their children, or escape abusive relationships. Some were victims of trafficking, caught in a web of coercion they couldn't break free from. Others were simply young and naive, running from broken homes and straight into the arms of someone far worse. Maria Gonzalez was someone who had once harbored dreams of a better life for her children. Rachel Simmons believed she'd make it to beauty school someday. Shauna Hayes thought she could start over if she'd just put a few more miles between herself and her past. They weren't nameless statistics. They were people, with dreams and struggles and hopes like anyone else. And yet to society they were little more than background noise until their faces appeared on the 6 o'clock news beneath headlines like, "Streetwalker Found Dead," or "Body of Unknown Woman Recovered." That was the true horror, the societal indifference that allowed people like Hayes to exist for as long as they did. Lessons etched in blood. Every horror story comes with its own moral, but in real life, the lessons often hurt far more than the fiction. Hayes wasn't a bomb that exploded in the middle of a community. He was a slow, creeping toxin, seeping into Elm Street and taking advantage of cracks that had been forming for decades. His evil was the product of neglect. Neglect from a society that turned its back on poverty-stricken neighborhoods, refused to invest in programs for at-risk youth, and dehumanized women for their lifestyles, without questioning how they ended up there in the first place. For law enforcement, the lessons run even deeper. The early signs were there, but they were ignored. When the first women vanished, there was no sense of urgency, no massive manhunt. Police labeled them as runaways, or working girls who probably left town. Instead of seeing them as daughters, mothers, or sisters in grave danger, they were dismissed as criminals, people whose decisions had somehow absolved the system of its responsibility to protect them. Hayes thrived in that apathy. He had years, maybe even decades, to perfect his methods because he knew there would be no rush to find the missing women he preyed upon. Every day that passed without action only emboldened him further, while signaling to the community that some lives simply mattered less. A community's call to action, Elm Street, once a forgotten strip of homes and shops at the edge of nowhere, became a national symbol after Hayes's trial, but its notoriety wasn't its downfall, it was its rebirth. Grassroots organizations banded together to ensure that Hayes's victims weren't just names on a list or faces in a grim gallery. They became the driving force behind change in the community. Support services expanded for vulnerable women. Outreach programs set up booths in the very places where Hayes had stalked his prey, offering free counseling, job training, and even transportation to safer areas. Shelters increased their capacity, and local businesses began donating food and supplies for those who had nowhere else to turn. The community realized that if they had shown this level of compassion and vigilance 5 or 10 years earlier, many of Hayes's victims might still be alive. More importantly, the tragedy forced lawmakers and police departments across the country to rethink how they handled cases involving missing persons from marginalized groups. Policies were adopted to prioritize missing individuals, regardless of their background or profession. New training modules discouraged the use of words like prostitute or transient in official records, instead encouraging officers to focus on the person behind the labels. Every life, they learned, had to be treated as precious, because the moment society starts to decide who matters and who doesn't, predators like Hayes start to grow in the shadows, carrying the weight forward. For the families of Hayes's victims, the healing process is ongoing. The void left by their loved ones is one that can never truly be filled, even with a conviction, a sentence, or societal reform. These families carry the weight of what could have been, a lifetime of birthdays, graduations, and quiet Sunday afternoons stolen by a man who saw their daughters, sisters, and mothers as disposable. And yet, in their grief, they've found new purpose. Maria Gonzalez's family began a scholarship fund for women immigrants. Emily Carter, the sole survivor who shattered the case wide open, uses her platform to speak out against violence toward women, addressing crowds with raw honesty about the night she escaped Hayes. "If we don't care for each other, someone like William Hayes will," she says often, "but not the way we dream, the way we fear. Never again." The final reminder of William Hayes's crimes is this: it wasn't just Elm Street that failed, it was all of us. In every city, town, and suburb, there are Mariahs, Rachels, and Shaunas, people teetering on the edge of invisibility. The lesson of Elm Street isn't just to mourn what happened, but to stop it from ever happening again. The tragedy revealed the cracks in society's foundation, and now it's up to us to fill them in. After all, monsters like Hayes don't thrive in vigilance, compassion, and empathy. They thrive in neglect, indifference, and turning a blind eye. May this lesson, written in heartbreak and blood, never be forgotten. As one grieving father said during a vigil, standing among a sea of candles and photographs, "We owe it to them, not just to remember their names but to change the world for the next ones."